All right, so if you've been following along with the channel, you've probably noticed something. The LG G5 has been mysteriously absent from all of my OLED comparisons. And yeah, I saw all of those comments that you all were leaving there for me, especially that one. But there is a really good reason for that. And look, Primary RGB Tandem OLED, sometimes referred to as 4-stack OLED, it isn't just another W-OLED refresh. This is a fundamentally different implementation of the tech that, to me, deserves its own category. Just like how QD-OLED carved out its own space a few years ago when Samsung first launched it. And these two technologies, they represent the absolute peak of what OLED can do right now, and they deserve their own proper head-to-head. So I want to break down the differences between these technologies, why those differences will actually matter in your living room, and ultimately, which OLED deserves to be the king. Okay, so what makes Primary RGB Tandem OLED different? That's a mouthful. Traditional W-OLED, what we've had for years, it creates white light from the OLED diodes and then filters that through red, green, blue, and then also white color filters to make an image. And it works really well, but just kind of naturally how light works whenever you're passing that light through filters, there's gonna be some light loss. In fact, that loss of light is exactly why W-OLED was created in the first place. Regular traditional OLEDs never really got bright enough. That was always its Achilles heel. Too much light was just getting lost whenever you're filtering it through those red, green, and blue filters. W-OLED added that white LED to sort of help recover as much of that lost light as it possibly could, thus sort of solving OLED's biggest problem. They were now bright enough for just about any room that you put them in. But LG just kind of sat back and then looked at their nearly perfect top of the line LG G4 OLED TV with like over 2,000 nits of brightness and just kind of said, it's not bright enough. Enter Tandem OLED. Instead of filtering white light, you get 4 separate OLED layers, 1 red layer, 1 green layer, and 2 blue layers. And that second blue layer isn't just for show. Blue OLED materials degrade faster than red and green, so having 2 blue layers share the load means that the TV is going to last longer and maintain color accuracy better over time. Theoretically. It's a pretty simple yet kind of clever workaround from LG. Now, the big advantage of this is that you have no color filters. Almost every bit of light that gets generated actually reaches your eyes instead of getting absorbed by those filters. It's more efficient, it's brighter, and theoretically longer lasting. QD-OLED, however, takes a completely different approach. Samsung started with just blue OLED panels and then uses quantum dot filters to convert some of that blue light into incredibly pure red and green. Now, these quantum dots are just going to be like microscopic particles that effectively they absorb one wavelength and then they spit out another with ridiculous precision. Now, both of these OLED flavors, they're going to give you all the same OLED goodness that we love. You get perfect blacks, infinite contrast, and viewing angles that just don't punish you for sitting off to the side, not kind of in the sweet spot right in the middle in your living room. But how they get there is what makes this comparison actually interesting. Now, brightness. This is where the G5 genuinely surprised me. LG claims that it's about 33% brighter than the G4 in SDR and even higher in HDR. And after testing both extensively, those percentages are pretty close to accurate. The LG G5 was hitting above 2,500 nits in HDR in a 10% window, which is very bright. And on top of that brightness, the 4-layer setup makes it run cooler, which helps maintain that high brightness for longer periods of time. It's pretty cool. So when I'm watching something like, I don't know, like Dune, like where those bright desert scenes, they kind of seem to go on forever, the LG G5, it doesn't seem to dim down in those really bright scenes like other OLEDs do. It helps maintain that punch throughout. QD-OLED TVs like the Samsung S95F, they still will hit really impressive peak brightness. We're still talking about over 2,000 nits, so it's nothing to sneeze at. But the LG G5 sustained the performance is legitimately better in the comparison. Color accuracy, however, is where QD-OLED has always flexed, and it still does here. Those quantum dots produce colors that are just more. Like when you're watching something like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse with like all like the neon and like comic book saturation, QD-OLED makes those colors pop in ways that just feels three-dimensional. But the LG G5 has like closed that gap significantly. The dedicated color layers really helps produce really clean and pure colors. It's just not quite at the QD-OLED levels of color volume, but we're talking about differences that you need like a colorimeter in order to see, like rather than like stuff just sort of jumping out in normal viewing. However, text clarity is actually worth mentioning if you game or use your TV as a monitor. The G5 uses standard RGB stripe subpixels, like kind of like how computer monitors do. So things like text are going to look crisp and clean. QD-OLED, however, uses a triangular subpixel layout that can create slight color fringing around text. It's really subtle, but if you're doing like productivity work or have like UI heavy games, it's definitely going to be noticeable. Now, longevity is where things get a little bit more theoretical. In principle, the G5 should last longer because you've got like the 4 layers sharing the workload instead of just relying heavily on one blue OLED layer, kind of like what QD-OLED does. Blue OLED material, it is just not as stable long-term. It questions of like burn-in and overall image dimming over years. It tends to be a general concern in most people's minds when they're thinking about QD-OLED. But here's the reality with all this like burn-in stuff with QD-OLED. Samsung and Sony have gotten really good at burn-in protection on their QD-OLED panels. Pixel shifting, logo detection, like automatic brightness limiting when static content is detected. Like the software protection is so advanced in these sets that burn-in has become mostly theoretical in normal use. You gotta really abuse that thing in order to actually have some burn-in show up and some image retention sort of stay on the screen. Now, the big question is whether the G5 will age better over like, say, like 5 to 10 years. Probably, but will you notice it with like typical viewing? Probably not. The screen finish might also be a thing that kind of helps determine which tech is right for certain people. The G5 uses a glossy screen that maintains those deep blacks and vibrant colors, even in bright rooms. But you will get reflections if you have like a lot of windows or like lights positioned, not in like ideal positions. Most QD-OLED TVs now use an anti-reflective coating that basically eliminates the reflections, but you know, it can kind of sometimes make the picture look slightly less punchy in really, really bright conditions. Neither is better per se across the board. It's kind of a preference thing. Glossy screens will look more dramatic in controlled lighting. Anti-reflective screens are a little bit more forgiving if your room setup isn't perfectly ideal for a reflective screen. But here is the part of the video where I'm probably going to lose some of you. Primary RGB Tandem OLED is genuinely impressive technology. You get better sustained brightness, better efficiency, theoretically better longevity, and the colors that finally can compete with what QD-OLED has been doing. This is kind of like the end game of OLED tech, right? But there is one massive problem with Tandem OLED.
There are only 3 major TVs using that technology: the LG G5, the LG M5, and the Panasonic Z95B. And I guess there's like a few from Philips, but like, let's be honest, like not a lot of people are genuinely considering buying Philips TVs anymore. But for the TVs that you'll actually buy, there's only 3 options, and all of those options are very expensive.
QD-OLED, however, is kind of everywhere now. Like Samsung has got the S95F and the S90F. Sony has the Bravia 8 Mark II, plus TVs from like Sony and Samsung from like a few years ago. Basically, you have choices. Like prices range from reasonable to premium, and those prices have been dropping way faster than LG can figure out how to mass produce Tandem OLED cheaply, at least. And all this sort of brings me back to my W-OLED versus QD-OLED conclusion that apparently annoyed so many people, according to the comments, at least. I picked W-OLED to win between those two, despite QD-OLED being a technically superior tech in several ways, more or less because of 2 big factors: price and longevity. It basically came down to there were simply more affordable W-OLED options, and W-OLED just had a longer track record. Same story here, but the answer is flipped. These 2 technologies between Tandem OLED and QD-OLED are so close in real-world performance that like arguing about which one is like better kind of like misses the point. And the performance gap is smaller than what either offers over traditional OLED. So you could easily come to the conclusion that either tech is kind of better based off of who you're talking to and kind of what their priorities are with the TV, what their living room looks like, and just things like that. And I know that that's kind of lame. It's hard to be objective about which is flat out better because the biggest possible difference between these two just kind of comes down to longevity, and there's simply not been enough time to come to that conclusion definitively. So that leaves us with more of a subjective answer. So of me, if I'm buying one today, which one am I going to be buying? I am buying a QD-OLED. Not because it's necessarily better. Again, that could go either way depending on your priorities. But I'm going with QD-OLED because you have options, been around a little bit longer than Tandem OLED. The Samsung S95F delivers incredible performance with that glare-free screen. The Sony Bravia 8 Mark II will give you Sony's incredible processing with that QD-OLED color. And even like last year's model, like the S95D, will absolutely blow most people away, which personally I think that's kind of a better buy than the S95F anyway. And you can find those for significantly less than a new G5 or M5. And we've seen this movie before with like new display technologies. Early adoption means you're paying more for less choice. But to be fair, that calculation will completely change in like 2 to 3 years when like other manufacturers start using Tandem OLED panels and LG figures out how to produce them a little bit more cost effectively. Then Primary RGB Tandem OLED probably takes its rightful place at the top of the OLED food chain. Today though, QD-OLED wins on value and variety. The performance difference isn't big enough to sort of justify paying more for fewer options. And see, I know that some of you are sitting here really annoyed with me that I came to this conclusion after I already picked W-OLED over QD-OLED in that versus comparison video before. I'm sure you're already furiously typing in the comments, but I can completely understand your frustration. Tandem OLED is, after all, just a 4th generation of W-OLED. So why does the newer version of the tech that I already preferred suddenly lose to QD-OLED now? Well, in that previous video, I already stated that QD-OLED was the better technology when it came to sort of like overall picture quality, but it wasn't that much better than W-OLED. The differences between the two would have to be noticed by like TV enthusiasts, and like kind of that's about it. The non-TV enthusiast, the overwhelming population of people who watch TVs, simply won't notice the subtle differences between those two types of OLED. So my winner in that video came down to which OLED tech was just the better value for the dollar, and that was W-OLED. You get more size options, more price options, all for very similar performance. It's almost the exact same story here. I think that Tandem OLED is technically the better TV tech, but just barely. I wouldn't say that it provides a better overall picture quality, I just think that it's a better implementation of the tech. But QD-OLED, it's just got more price options, and it's got multiple years of TVs to choose from. Between these two, Tandem OLED and QD-OLED, you're simply getting a better value for your dollar with QD-OLED. All right, so hopefully now you can see why I omitted the G5 from my previous W-OLED videos. It was conflicting with my thoughts on like the G4 and all like the younger generations. But listen, like a couple years time, again, when Primary RGB Tandem OLED, it becomes more mature, it'll probably emerge as like the top OLED between the two. It's more efficient, it's brighter where it matters, and it should last longer, and it kind of represents everything that OLED is supposed to become. LG finally built an OLED that can go toe-to-toe with QD-OLED's color performance while fixing every other weakness that the technology had. But being the better technology doesn't make it the better buy, at least not today. All right. So that was a fun one, at least it was for me. But if you enjoyed the video as well, I'd appreciate you letting me know by tapping that like button. It matters a lot to the video's performance, and to my heart. And while you're down there, subscribe button real close by. So if you feel so inclined, go ahead and hit that one as well. And also, just as a reminder, like TV prices, they change constantly. So like make sure to check the description of my videos for current deals going on in the space. There seems to be a TV sale around every corner. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.